So friends, Donald Trump's former chief of staff and current RICO co-defendant, Mark Meadows, is trying to wiggle out from under his Georgia state prosecution. He's trying to have the case transferred from Georgia state court into federal court so he can try to get the charges against him dismissed. You know what, friends? It ain't gonna work. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, Mark Meadows, former chief of staff to Donald Trump, tried to help Trump steal the Georgia state presidential election in 2020. And for his crimes, he's been indicted in a RICO case in Georgia state court. And now he wants his prosecution transferred from Georgia state court to federal court because he wants to try to get his case dismissed. Why? Well, he says, I was acting within the scope of my official duties as chief of staff to the President of the United States. There's a hearing in the case scheduled for Monday, and the federal judge will begin taking testimony to see if there is anything to Mark Meadows' claim. Let's start with the reporting. This from CNN. Headline, Meadows trying to move Fulton County case to federal court. And that article begins, former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is seeking to move the Fulton County, Georgia prosecution against him to federal court so that he can try to get the case dismissed under federal law. Meadows argued in a new court filing submitted to the U.S. District Court of the Northern District of Georgia that he is entitled to bring a federal immunity defense because the Georgia state charges against him stem from his conduct as then President Donald Trump's chief of staff. On Wednesday, a federal judge scheduled an August 28th hearing for Meadows and others to present evidence about whether to move the case. The judge noted the state court case can proceed at this time. Mark Meadows' claim will almost certainly fail. Here's why. Mark Meadows was involved in a criminal conspiracy with a criminal president to criminally overturn the results of a state court election. That is not within the scope of the official duties of a chief of staff to the President of the United States, and anybody with any sense knows it. In fact, it takes the muddled thinking and the tortured analysis of a lawyer to suggest that Mark Meadows' conduct was legitimately within the scope of his official duties as chief of staff. Come on, friends. First of all, state court elections in a presidential race are run by the states. They're the exclusive province of the states. A chief of staff to the president has no right, has no business sticking his nose into a state court election or a recount, particularly when Mark Meadows was on that dirty phone call with Donald Trump, urging Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to just find a fictitious 11,780 votes so Mark Meadows could help install his boss back into the presidency for a second term against the expressed will, the expressed votes of the Georgia state voters. When there actually is a straight-faced claim that a state court prosecution should perhaps be transferred to federal court? Let me give you a concrete example. This is a case we had in Washington, D.C. I'm pretty intimately familiar with it because I know some of the people involved. There were two federal officers, specifically Park Police officers, who engaged in a shooting during a traffic stop. Now, They were entitled to discharge their weapons. They were entitled to use force during a traffic stop if it was lawfully necessary to use force, up to and including deadly force. They were federal officers, and the state of Virginia, more precisely the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Fairfax County Prosecutor's Office, brought local criminal charges against these two federal officers, saying that essentially this was a criminal shooting. It was excessive force by these two federal officers. But here's the thing. Federal officers are entitled to use force. And so the question became, were they acting within the scope of their legitimate federal duties, or did they sort of abandon the protection that they would otherwise have, the sort of qualified immunity they might otherwise have, because they engaged in excessive force, converting something that was in the scope of their official duties to something that was criminal, because it was beyond the scope of their official duties. Here's what happened in that case. The Fairfax County authorities indicted them. They filed to have their case removed from Fairfax County, from the Virginia court system to the federal court system, claiming they were acting within the scope of their official duties. That motion was granted, and then, unfortunately, the federal judge dismissed the case, which I happen to believe was a grave injustice, having been pretty familiar with the facts, most importantly, having watched a videotape of the shooting. But friends, that is an example, a real-world example of where there might be an issue with respect to a federal officer being charged in state court and successfully filing to have the case transferred to federal court. Mark Meadows trying to steal the Georgia state election together with his co-conspirator Donald Trump ain't that. Let me use an analogy. Let's assume those two federal police officers didn't engage in an excessive force shooting. Instead, they robbed a 7-Eleven. Guess what? That case would not have been removed from the Virginia court system to the federal court system. Why? Because they would be acting well beyond the scope of their official duties as federal police officers. Well, guess what? Mark Meadows robbed the Georgia voters of the full value of their vote. And there is no way that is within the scope of the official duties of a chief of staff to the President of the United States. And that's why Mark Meadows' motion should be denied. Mark Meadows should be made to sit shoulder to shoulder with his 19 RICO co-defendants, who were all part of a criminal enterprise to corruptly overturn the results of a Georgia presidential election. And if I had to bet, I'd bet the farm. The farm for me is $1. I'm not a gambling man. I am not a high roller. $1 is my betting limit. Well, I would bet the full dollar that after this hearing on Monday that is set in Mark Meadows' case in federal court, his motion to have his case transferred from state court to federal court will be denied, and Mark Meadows will be on trial with the rest of his RICO co-defendants in Georgia. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.